Hey everybody, in Chapter 15, Lesson 2, what we're going to take a look at here is how President Kennedy changes American society. In particular, how does he use foreign policy to change American society? How does he interact with other countries? And what that's going to continue our long-term fight against communism, right? And there's two things we're going to look at on this slide. We're going to look at something called flexible response and how we can use America's economic might to fight communists around the world. Because remember, prior to this, communism is in all different kinds of places around the world. It's in, of course, the Soviet Union, which I'm circling there in green. It's in Eastern Europe. We stopped it in Turkey. We stopped it in Iran, but it's in China. It's in North Korea, possibly spreading to other places. It gets to Cuba in 1959. We'll talk about Cuba in more detail today. But Kennedy's going to try and commit America to fighting against communism long term. So let's take a look first at how he does this militarily. He has this idea, this plan, and he calls it flexible response. And the concept of flexible response, it's pretty simple. It means that we have to have more conventional weapons, and that's kind of like the way you would typically fight a war: tanks, guns, airplanes, jets, navy, that kind of thing. It says that we need to have the kinds of resources available to fight a limited war, limited objectives, limited use of resources, without nuclear weapons, because not everything that we do has to have nuclear weapons. Remember that Kennedy didn't like massive retaliation threatening the use of nuclear weapons because it might lead to the end of the world. So he says what we need to do instead of this is begin to spend more money on our military so that we can have a larger military that can fight anywhere, anytime around the globe that we needed to in order to stop communism. Economically, he's got two plans in mind, and his goal is to help poorer nations. I want you to think back to when we used the Marshall Plan to help Western Europe. We gave those countries like France and Italy, we gave them a ton of money so that they could rebuild their country so that communism wouldn't be attractive to poor people. In Kennedy's mind, we can do something similar with other nations around the world that are still impoverished. He's going to say that we can start the Alliance for Progress. What that is it's a series of kind of aid projects where we give money to these Latin American governments, and then the countries in Latin America, South America, that get this money, they can use it to build programs that have already been approved. Like, let's say a country like Bolivia wants to build a dam to provide electricity for its people, but it doesn't have the money to do it. They can come to America and say, what about getting the money from the Alliance for Progress from America to build a dam here in Bolivia? All right, do that. That'll work. The other thing he starts is called the Peace Corps, and this actually is way more successful. And we know it's way more successful because it's still around today. The Peace Corps sends American volunteers to countries that request assistance for 2 years, and it helps those countries build infrastructure, wells, piping, roads, schools. Like, for example, here's a school that Peace Corps volunteers helped build that's still functioning in West Africa. So we have lots of different programs that are out there that help these countries. And the Peace Corps still does this. It's an option that you too can do, actually, when you graduate. You can sign up and join the Peace Corps for 2 years to help people around the world. So those are two of Kennedy's efforts to find a way to contain communism. But the tricky thing about this is that Kennedy can't just contain communism on Earth anymore. He's got to actually contain communism in space, because the Soviets are way ahead of us in the space race. The Soviets set up that first satellite, Sputnik, and then they send up this dude right here. He's the first guy ever to orbit the Earth in space. His name is Yuri Gagarin. He's the first guy up there. America's disturbed by this, so President Kennedy says we've got to find a way to contain communists in space too. He describes this as a space race. To contain the communists in space, we have to win the space race. We need to show dominance in our space exploration capability. He says our goal in the space race is to is to be the United States as the first country to put a man on the moon. And we do that in July of 1969 when Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong land on the moon. And the Eagle has landed. That was Armstrong's first words on the moon. The Eagle, by the way, is that thing right there. That's the landing pod right there. That's the Eagle. The Eagle is landed. He's the first dude Neil Armstrong's first dude on the moon, right? One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. There it is. There's the flag on the moon. Still there. Flag's still there on the moon. So, yeah, this is a way for us to contain communism, not just on Earth, but in space, to be dominant. And the Soviets never reached the moon. They didn't get there. We won the space race. So we have flexible response, containing it militarily. We have Alliance for Progress and Peace Corps trying to contain it economically. And we've got the space race, putting a man on the moon to stop communism from showing that it's technologically superior in space. The tricky thing, though, is that Kennedy does have to try and continue to contain communism in small countries with covert operations. And one of these places that President Kennedy has to do this is actually a place that Eisenhower was unable to stop, because in 1959, when Eisenhower was still president, this dude right down here, that dude took over the government of Cuba. That's Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro just died, right, 2016. Fidel Castro overthrows the corrupt Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, and he establishes a new communist government. And so Cuba is now communist. Now, why is this a big deal? Why does that matter to us? Because Cuba is really close to the United States. We were trying to keep communism from spreading it in poorer countries. And Eisenhower, right before he left office, said that he was afraid the USSR was going to use Cuba to spread revolution in Latin America. He actually authorized, Eisenhower did, he authorized the CIA to train a whole bunch of Cuban exiles, 1,400 Cubans who were living in America, and plan an invasion of Cuba. We actually said that what we're going to do is we're going to send and train these 1,400 Cubans who fled from Cuba, and we're going to invade the Bay of Pigs. We're going to invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. And the goal is, when these 1,400 Cubans show up from America and they get there, then what'll happen is that the people of Cuba will rise up and they will overthrow Castro. President Kennedy got in, he made some changes to the operation, set it in motion. But the invasion was a disaster. So what we did here, you had 4 transports landing of almost 1,500 American sponsored Cuban refugees. I know this says American soldiers, but they were Cuban refugees who were living in Miami at the time. The average age of them was 23. There were way more Cubans in the Cuban army versus these small number of an American force, because remember, the Cuban people were supposed to rise up. We lost 5 planes. We had that were shot down. One of them was lost. 2 boats were sunk. 400 were killed. Another 1,000 captured. And the only way we get them back is by giving $53 billion in today's money of food and drugs. That's a ton of money that we have to give in food and drugs to Cuba to get back those lost soldiers. So it was a disaster, and it humiliated Kennedy, absolutely humiliated him, and exposed the failure of our use of covert operations, right? That we're here trying to overthrow countries. Definitely made things harder for Kennedy, and it made it harder to contain communism with covert operations. So if we take a step back here really quick and we look, right, we had flexible response for the military, we had Alliance for Progress, we had Peace Corps economically to contain communism, we have the space race to contain communism, all 3, for the most part, successes. We had covert operations to try and contain communism, not quite so much of a success, but where Kennedy does shine especially well is in moments of crisis. In moments of crisis, Kennedy is successfully able to keep communism from spreading. I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. One of these examples would be in 1961. The dictator of the USSR, a guy named Khrushchev, and President Kennedy had a meeting, it's called a summit in Berlin, in Vienna, Austria, about this topic of Berlin. And they were going to discuss Berlin because, remember, Berlin was divided. In East Berlin, and I'll highlight it in red, it was communist. And I'll highlight in green West Berlin, which was democracy. And because we have one city that is split in half, part communist, part democracy, this city becomes a focal point, the center of the kind of the conflict. It's like the point of the swords of communism in the East, democracy in the West. It's the point of the sword where the two touch. And Khrushchev wants the West to leave Berlin. And Kennedy's like, dude, I'm not leaving, right? I'm not leaving Berlin. Remember, it was half controlled, right? So when Kennedy refuses to leave Berlin, Khrushchev builds a wall around it. He builds a wall around West Berlin to stop people in the communist East from fleeing into the democratic West. He wants to put an end to that. Because if people are fleeing communism, that must mean it sucks, right? If he can find a way to put an end to that, then he doesn't have to admit that communism has problems. So he builds this wall all the way around West Berlin, the democratic half of the city, in order to keep people from getting into it. For nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall symbolizes the Cold War divisions between the Soviet Union and the West. The wall becomes to symbolize that repression and division. It's a pretty big deal, but by refusing to leave, Kennedy shows that he's able to contain communism in moment of crisis. I'll give you one more example really quick. October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy comes on the television and he announces that American spy planes had taken aerial photographs of Cuba. And here's one of the actual pictures that they took. They take these aerial photographs of Cuba, and what it shows is that the Soviets have long-range missiles in Cuba, nuclear missiles. Right there. Nuclear missiles. Oh, man. Now, why is that a problem? Well, number one, right, Cuba's close to the United States. It's only 90 miles away from our coast, right? It's obviously a problem. But number two, if the Soviets ever launch those missiles, that's their effective range. If they're short-range missiles, they can only get to this much of our country. But if it's the long-range missiles, they could hit anywhere inside our country within just a few minutes. In response, Kennedy ordered a Navy quarantine of the island. He put our ships around Cuba. You can see kind of that circle there, right, around Cuba. This is the quarantine. It says that no one would be allowed to go past our ships that surrounded Cuba. And he said that those missiles have to be taken out of Cuba. And he says, if you don't do this, you cross the quarantine, you don't take away those missiles, we're going to war, nuclear war. It's actually really tense because the Soviets have ships heading to Cuba. And at the last second, they decide to turn around. And an agreement is struck between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Khrushchev says, we'll take the missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev says that we won't invade Cuba. Or Kennedy promises to not invade Cuba. And Kennedy says, I'll take any nuclear missiles I have out of Turkey, which is near the Soviet border. And both sides are able to back down. But we come really close to nuclear war. But in this moment of crisis, Kennedy's able to keep us from going over the edge. Look, because neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy want nuclear war, right? So both sides agree to ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere in 1963. But all of these things make the Soviets look weak. They don't get Berlin, they don't get Cuba, and they have a nuclear test ban. Ultimately, that meant that Khrushchev was going to lose his job. He was removed from power. And while Khrushchev is going to be removed from power, that doesn't necessarily matter to Kennedy for very long, because on November 22nd, when he's visiting Dallas, Texas, he's assassinated. He was shot twice, once in the neck, once in the head. The man accused of killing him is the guy right beneath my head. That's kind of a crazy and bitter Marxist named Lee Harvey Oswald. He's a communist named Marxist. He was never put on trial, Oswald, even though he shot the president, because he was killed by a nightclub owner in Dallas, Texas, a guy named Jack Ruby. And conspiracy theorists like to think that this was done on purpose. The CIA did it, or the mob did it, or some other group, and Oswald was killed to keep him quiet, or some, the conspiracy. No. The federal government investigated the matter. They looked into it. The committee was called the Warren Commission, and they concluded that Oswald, Kennedy's assassin, acted alone. There was no one else involved. No second shooters, no foreign governments, none of that. And as a result, the vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will end up becoming president and taking the world in a bit of a different direction. And we'll talk more about that coming up.